Good afternoon. I'm Susan Garrett, former Illinois State Senator and now Chair of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. On behalf of our board and our Executive Director, Sarah Bruni, we welcome you to today's forum, Campaign Finance Reform, What We've Learned Since 2011. For those of you who are not familiar with ICPR, we were founded almost 20 years ago by U.S. Senator Paul Simon, a Democrat, and Lieutenant Governor Bob Kustra, a Republican. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission is to, 1, initiate reforms and promote public participation in government, 2, address the role of money in politics, like we're doing today, and 3, encourage integrity, accountability, and transparency at all levels of government. We advocate our mission through the use of 3 primary tools: free educational forums, legislative reforms, we go to Springfield, technology projects that make government data available to the public free of charge. One of our greatest assets is an online database, IllinoisSunshine.org. That database continuously provides updates all day long on Illinois campaign expenditures and contributions, the who, what, where, and when of tracking political money in Illinois. As an example, through our weekly updates, we reported that during the March 2016 primary, over $15.5 million was spent by super PACs alone to influence local elections. We also found that over $22 million was spent by PACs, super PACs, and political committees during the primary election on media advertising throughout the state. The reason these numbers are important is because we believe that tracking and reporting out of state and sometimes anonymous contributions can shine a light on those that may try to have an impact on influencing public policies in Illinois. That's why today's panel discussion on campaign finance reforms initiated in 2011 is so relevant. Were they good reforms or not? And what should we focus on moving forward? We are extremely fortunate to have panelists who will address these questions and bring a variety of perspectives and expertise to this issue. There will be a short Q&A following the panel discussion. There are note cards in each of your programs, so please write any questions you may have for the panelists, and we will collect the cards at the end of the discussion. And you can tweet about this using our hashtag ILCFR16. Finally, thank you to Columbia College for their help in hosting this event. They have been an excellent partner in this arena, and we are extremely grateful. And thank you to Blue Room Stream for the live stream of today's event. So let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome ICPR Executive Director and today's moderator, Sarah Bruni.
Hello, thank you all so much for coming. I know it's very beautiful out, but what could be more fun than talking about the law and numbers combined? So I really appreciate you taking the time to come. Like Susan said, if you could please tag us in your tweets and mention us, that'd be great so we can keep track of all of that. Also, as we go, feel free to pass your question note cards to the end of your aisle, because we'll do a sweep kind of throughout to pick stuff up, so when we start the Q&A, we get started strong. So I'd like to first ask our very distinguished panelists to go down the line and sort of introduce themselves. All of them have a very extensive background in this subject, and so I'd like to hear a little bit about them. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm the ringer. I'm Dan Weissman. I'm a reporter from WBEZ. Oh, look at that. I pressed the button. I've never been on one of these before. I'm Dan Weissman. I'm a reporter from WBEZ, and I'm basically a beneficiary of this law. I'm a consumer of this information. And used it a lot in covering the Springs primary in the 5th Legislative District, where Ken Duncan was heavily backed financially by people who appear to be associated with Governor Bruce Rauner. It was fascinating, and this allowed us, I mean, we didn't have to ask anybody, what was happening, because we just knew where all the money was coming from and what was happening, for the most part.
Your line is broken, but it works.
You're like,
Minor details.
you can use this.
My name is Scott Kennedy. I'm the founder of Illinois Election Data. It's a website that I use as a hobby to track information about elections.
Technical difficulty.
Along with vote totals and budget info. In this past primary, I had a little bit more free time than I was expecting, so I spent a little bit of time tracking a lot of the campaign finance and spending, and that's why I'm here.
Good afternoon. I'm Don Harmon. I represent the 39th Legislative District in the State Senate, and I have been involved in many of the campaign finance reform laws and election law reforms over the last decade, and was the chief sponsor of the bill in the Senate that we're going to chat most about today.
Good afternoon. I'm Sam McCann. I'm the state senator for the 50th district. That's 9 counties in downstate west central Illinois. I suppose my relevancy to the situation here today, or the meeting here today, is in the last primary. Some of you may have heard about that primary, and some of us heard more about it than others. I have a kind of a unique situation, and I've been in office a little over 5 years, and in 5 years I've had 3 contested races. My first contested race against, in a general election against an incumbent from the other party, of course, was at that time, that was before the Citizens United ruling, was the most expensive state legislative race in the nation. And then, of course, I now had a primary just a couple of years after arriving in the Senate. And then, of course, this most recent primary, where it's the most expensive Republican primary in the state. And so I look forward to participating, and thank you for having me.
My name is William McNary, and I'm the co-director of Citizen Action Illinois, and was a member of the Illinois Campaign Finance Reform Task Force. And one of the tasks of the Illinois Campaign Finance Reform Task Force was to examine public financing of elections and make recommendations to then Governor Quinn and members of the Illinois General Assembly on how to implement it. This 205-page document here is the result of our work that we presented. It has yet to be implemented at this point. As a matter of fact, the current governor refused to receive the report because he decided that it was not presented to him in a timely manner. So I'm going to be talking a lot about public financing of elections. We've been doing this since for a long time, since Don Clark Netsch in our previous iteration introduced and passed a public financing of election bills back in the 80s that was vetoed by Governor Thompson. We introduced our own clean money elections bill under then Representative, now Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, and we continue to introduce the Lincoln Act and other public financing bills. So I'll spend a lot of time talking about that.
And I'm Tom Newman. I'm the Director of Campaign Disclosure for the Illinois State Board of Elections. Been with the board for about 17 years now, in disclosure the entire time, and we're the division that is tasked with enforcing the campaign finance laws in the state. So I guess we've got a little something to do with the discussion today.
Thank you all so much. I'd like to have Senator Harmon sort of give us some background on many of the reforms that went into effect in 2011 and his involvement in those.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Senator Garrett, for convening the meeting, and to all of you for coming out today to talk about this. I was thinking back to the session in which we passed the first ever limits on campaign contributions. And at the time, I would begin almost every speech with the same little shtick. And I think I resurrected it because I think it helps to explain the atmosphere in Springfield in the spring of 2009. So my January of 2009 was unlike any other. In the first week of January, the House impeached the governor. In the second week of January, we installed a new General Assembly. We elected a new Senate President and Minority Leader in the Senate. And the House impeached the governor again, just to make sure that it stuck. In the third week of January, many of us traveled to Washington, D.C. to celebrate the inauguration of one of our former colleagues in the State Senate as President of the United States. And in the fourth week of January, we returned to Springfield. We tried the governor. We convicted him and removed him from office and banned him from ever holding any other elective office. And we installed a new governor in the state of Illinois. That was a hell of a January. But it did create a remarkable opportunity, and it's also important to remember what got us there, at least with respect to the governor. It was a significant campaign finance reform bill we passed in the last General Assembly, the ban on pay-to-play contributions. That triggered a horrible reaction in the sitting governor, who tried, before the law went into effect on January 1st of 29, to gobble up as much campaign money as he possibly could, and used whatever tools he had in his illegitimate toolbox to do that. So that's the law that triggered this debacle. And so after the impeachment and the removal, there was a real agenda for reform. We did things like reforming the Freedom of Information Act, the procurement rules, a whole host of things triggered by Blagojevich's excesses. And I was tasked with negotiating the campaign finance reform. Certainly didn't do it alone. Senator Garrett was a key partner through all of this, and a great sounding board as we tried to figure out what would work and what wouldn't work. And President John Cullerton was also key in pushing to make sure this happened. It was not universally popular in the General Assembly, but it was the right time. So just very broadly speaking, there were a couple of key guiding principles in the way we tried to draft the limits. And I think it helps to understand both what we got right and the criticisms of the law. The first was a real emphasis on transparency. We tried to make sure that people could see what was happening in campaign finance in close to real terms. So under the old regime, you filed reports twice a year, semi-annually, at the end of the first half of the year, January through June, and then in the second half of the year, June or July through December. And only in the handful, the 30 days before an election, did you have any requirement to disclose large contributions in real time. So we changed that. We created quarterly filings for all committees, and we made year-round real-time reporting the law for contributions of $1,000 or more. And I think that's probably had our biggest success coming out of that law. The other philosophical thing that I know I focused on, and others talked about this, we were trying to figure out how money in politics works. And the distinction that we drew was between outside money and inside money, if you will. So once money is contributed to a political committee, how it's moved around among political committees after that, as long as it's transparent, is really not as much of a concern as how do you limit the amount of money from outside of the system flowing into the system. And that's where the limits did have an impact, because they're reasonable limits on individual and corporate contributions. The limits on transfers among political committees is larger, but again, the focus was on outside money and inside money. And in the end, it was a pretty big deal, the bill that we passed. And I think on the margin of success, we anticipated rich candidates spending their own money. We did not anticipate Citizens United. And that happened literally months after the bill went into, we passed it. We are still grappling with what that means. The big success, I do think, is the transparency of the database that you run, the database that you check on a regular basis and report on, really has had an impact on how people view campaign finance in Illinois. And I think that the limits have had an impact on many normal small races. They have had almost no impact on big races for governor, for mayor, for key legislative races, Sam. I'm sorry about that. It all worked out very well. But the impact there has been minimal, and the birth of independent expenditure committees, the dark money committees under Citizens United, has made things profoundly worse. So no matter what happens with our limit system, I think the transparency is a good thing. I think we have to focus on the independent expenditures. And I think the first step is to increase disclosure. The notion that you can hide money coming into the political system, it runs so afoul to the whole philosophy we had about the inside money and the outside money. We want to know where money from outside the political system is coming into the political system. And if you can hide that in a dressed-up not-for-profit corporation that does nothing other than funnel money into independent expenditure committees, we've lost all of that transparency and accountability. So we still have our work cut out for us, and I'm sure that other panelists will have very real-world experiences with how this works. both as academics and as practitioners. And I look forward to the discussion and to the questions. So thanks again for having us.
Thank you. So I want to start sort of broad and then narrow in. You talked about some of the key parts of the legislation that you passed, and that was adding quarterly filings, adding year-round disclosure of contributions over $1,000, those are called A1s, and contribution limits were a big part of that. So I'd like to hear, Senator Harman or other panelists, which of those provisions do you think has most affected our current political system in Illinois, and positively or negatively?
I'd certainly defer to other folks for different opinions. I think transparency is a real big deal. We are much more aware, I think, of the campaign contributions coming in. I know personally, if any money comes in during the legislative session, I don't hold many fundraisers during the session, but if something comes in, I'm much more acutely aware of what that means to file a report saying, I just got a check for $1,000 from so-and-so. And I think more carefully about, do I accept this contribution? Do I send it back? Is there some relationship to the legislative session? I try to focus my own fundraising outside of session, not entirely because of that, but it certainly adds to it. The limits have had a real impact too. It's harder to raise money, especially in legislative leadership positions when you're raising money for a caucus or for a political party. Where limits didn't exist before, people now have to structure their plans for how they're going to raise enough money to be competitive on a statewide basis. And it's had an impact in how folks raise money.
Senator McCann, I'd love to hear from you on this as well. How, the contributions limits specifically, I know, sort of have affected you in the last year, to say the least. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, yeah, interestingly enough, when we talk about contribution limits, I guess we learned ultimately that there really aren't any, because we have a law that essentially rewards you for breaking the law. I don't know if any other state does that or not, but it says that once we hit a certain plateau, and I think it was the $100,000 for the IEs, and Tom can certainly correct me on any fact-checking portions here that I get wrong, but so there were no limits, So once they did that the very first day, their very first contribution, the limits were off, and I understand, and my hat's off to Senator Harman and Senator Garrett for what they attempted to do, and I think that a big part of what they did, there were some good things. The transparency on the quarterly filings, big help. But again, ultimately, and I know you didn't see Citizens United coming, and I wasn't in the General Assembly until January of 2011. So essentially, there are no limits, and what that does is that really induces or entices or incentivizes the mega wealthy, or maybe even scads of the mega wealthy, to give plenty of money and to hide it in these independent expenditures, and also even on the procurement side. I think when Senator Harman mentioned that a few moments ago, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were essentially, when you mentioned that, that's essentially a road builder shouldn't be giving massive amounts of money to a gubernatorial candidate or any statewide candidate. Is that correct? Right. Well, but interestingly enough, we still exist in a time when, whether it's a road builder or any other, it could be any other contractor with the state, but road builder is a good example. You can have a road builder with $200 million worth of contracts with the state, or negotiate, or hoping to have, and he can't give that either gubernatorial candidate a dime if he currently has $50,000 or more in contracts. But he can send $500,000 or $1 million or $10 million straight to the National Republican Governors Association or the National Democratic Governors Association. They can wire that money from their bank this morning to the National Governors Association of either party, and that National Governors Association can turn around and immediately do a wire transfer to the respective candidates' PAC that afternoon. So how is that reform when there is no reform? It really is a slap in the face to the people of Illinois to say that embodies any type of reform, and that's not a personal comment to anyone here. Again, I think there were unintended consequences and unforeseen consequences. And then thirdly, I think when you talk about the the caucus money. You know, you have 4 caucus leaders, right? You have 4 caucuses and 4 caucus leaders. And while Senator Harmon is correct, while he's correct that it's made it maybe a little more difficult to raise the big dollars and spread it around, what that's done is it's created, I think, a sense of, I don't know, I think it may be sheepism. You know, I think the people elect us. There's 59 members of the Senate, 118 members of the House, and they send us there to be the 177 shepherds of the state. And so what that does is before the campaign finance reform, any of you could give me essentially as much as you wanted. Now you're limited. But once those 4 caucus leaders collect that money, if they like a particular member or a certain group of members better than others, maybe they help them more than others. So I think it's created a little more of the emperor has, is looking mighty fine today when in fact maybe he isn't. If any of that makes sense. So what it's done is I think it's made rank and file members maybe a little more dependent. While it may be fewer gross dollars, it's made them more dependent on the caucus leadership, which I don't think is a good thing.
Tell us how you really feel. Just kidding. Getting right into it. I like it. Dan, that I think points to a race that you covered very extensively this primary, the Duncan Stratton race, and some creative ways of funneling the party money, to say the least. If you could just talk about that a little bit.
Sure, and I apologize for not reviewing my notes before coming on over here. But here's basically we saw money flowing super fast, and that tipped us off to the story. Like in the good side of was the transparency. Like we were able to see what was happening. If you think that unlimited amounts of money flowing into small races is a bad thing, then that would be the downside. What happened was we saw an independent expenditure committee, which is called a super PAC, right? And just to review, probably nobody needs this explained to them, but I'm like super pedantic, right? And I'm going to ask to be corrected on this because you guys know this much better than me. But a super PAC is an independent expenditure group. Basically, the rule is they can take in money. They can spend what they like, but they can't coordinate directly with another campaign. So I believe that this was Illinoisans for Growth and Opportunity.
Yep.
Made a $500,000, and let's crowdsource this, whoever remembers this better than I do, made a $500,000 contribution to the campaign of Ken Duncan, who was a Democrat representing the 5th District, a little tiny narrow sliver of Chicago that runs from the Gold Coast to 79th Street. It's a very interestingly shaped district. Interestingly, right, it would be hard to kind of organize a grassroots campaign in a district that's shaped like that, right? So money make it seem like money might matter a fair amount. So $500,000 they spend on consulting services and other things to support his candidacy. And what that does is it takes, as Senator McCann was alluding to, it takes the limits off of that race, right? The idea is you can only, contributions to individual candidates, contributions to individual races, there's strict limits unless certain things happen. Unless an independent expenditure group spends a certain amount of money, unless a candidate self-funds, right, to a certain extent. And then, and I think, Senator McCann, this may be what you were alluding to, all the limits come off. And so in some ways, the idea, I think, Senator Harmon used to tell me, is that was intended to say, look, if this guy suddenly has an unlimited bank account, you shouldn't be restricted from raising money. That's only fair. But what we saw was also it meant that the person who made the first spend also then has no ceiling, right? So the limits were off. Ultimately, what happened was there were I apologize. I had the wrong date for this, so I should have reviewed these notes. But what happened was not only did an independent expenditure group get involved, but there was a second group, which was organized as a 501c4. These are the groups that were essentially ratified by the Citizens United decision. They are nonprofit, a kind of vanilla nonprofit organization is organized under Section 501c3 of the Federal Tax Code. And that's like the Red Cross. Contributions to 501c3s are tax exempt. And 501c3s are not allowed to do certain things like engage in political campaigning. 501c4s, as kind of ratified by the Citizens United decision, are allowed to, are not tax exempt. Contributions are taxable. They are allowed to, the distinction is they're allowed to engage in advocacy up to just under 50% of their revenue. 501c4s, like 501c3s, are subject to fairly limited disclosure requirements themselves. They don't have to disclose who gives them money. And they also are subject to fairly limited, except when they make direct investments in campaigns, fairly limited disclosure requirements about how they spend their money. So it's a little hard to track. So we don't know where the money's coming from. We don't always know exactly where it's going to. Between independent expenditure money and 501c4 money, millions of dollars were spent in support of Ken Duncan, who had, and so why, right? We should check. We should ask, like, why? Oh, how did all this happen? Why this guy? Why this whole district? So you may have heard there's no budget in this state. That's a continuing story. Democrats have held a supermajority in both houses in this cycle. But then, and so that's a reason there's been a standoff between them and the executive. But in the fall, Ken Duncan broke rank on a couple of key votes. He declined to vote with the supermajority, and so they failed to override a couple of vetoes of the governors. And there was a question about whether that would be an alliance, what that might mean. Senator McCann has an interesting story that's kind of parallel to that I really hope someone will tell in the course of today's. Well, it's not exactly right. Well, it's a mirror image, right? It has a correspondence to it. Right? Yeah, that's fair. So what normally happens in a situation like this is if you break with the party leadership, as Senator McCann was alluding to, can then funnel money because contributions among, like, once the money's in the political system, the party leadership can funnel an essentially, effectively unlimited amount of money, assuming they have an unlimited amount of money to support you. Or they can support a candidate running against you. They can, what's called primarying you, right? And so that is a reason, according to conventional wisdom that people like me, because we don't really know anything, we just subscribe to, is that that's conventional wisdom says, like, that is one reason that people tend to vote with their leadership. Is the leadership has the power, if you step out of line, to punish you by running a candidate against you and funneling support to that candidate. So the speculation was, well, would Ken Duncan be primaried? He was. Somebody ran against him. But then the first move in terms of spending was this money coming from independent expenditure groups that we were able to see were funded by people who we could also see had supported Governor Rauner financially or had other ties to him. So this was like on the record. That was cool. Eventually, millions of dollars were spent. More money was spent in support of Mr. Duncan than in support of his opponent. And Mr. Duncan lost. We were able, thanks to, but this was, as far as we could tell, the most expensive state legislative race on record. Certainly in Illinois, and I talked to people from around the country, this was super, super unusual. So, as Senator Harman has said, on the one hand, for what are called normal races, this was, there were really limits. For non-normal races, there aren't. And we saw that this was a huge escalation of spending. And the question, I'd be interested in asking a question to the other panelists of, like, there's a large number of legislative elections are totally uncontested, right? And so the idea of, like, a normal election versus an abnormal election, it's somewhat abnormal for there to be a serious contest, right? These are the only contests in which there's really spending in a significant amount are these kind of targeted races where leadership of one kind or another tends to be involved. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, sure. And again, there are normal races. So this is my 5th term. In 5 election cycles, I've had 3 contested races. I've won all of them fairly decidedly, but it's difficult to run half of a campaign. So even if I'm running against an under-resourced candidate who doesn't have much currency in the district, you still spend $100,000 to $150,000 to do all the things that you need to do in a Senate district. You can communicate with your voters to make sure folks turn out to run a campaign. So there are normal races in that sense, even when they are lightly contested. A couple of observations just on the conversation so far. I want to be clear, the unlimited amounts of money that are flowing in to some campaigns today are not caused by our reforms. And I think this is an important distinction. We didn't contain them because we didn't anticipate Citizens United, but they're not caused by that. The Millionaires Amendment, which we put in the bill at the front end, was a recognition that there would be self-funding candidates who bring inordinate resources to a race. And it was important, we thought, to make sure the playing field was level and that one candidate wasn't so grossly out-resourced by another candidate. The way the Supreme Court had ruled on a similar provision in another state, we couldn't lift the limits on the other candidates without also lifting them on the millionaire. So after Citizens United, we passed a second similar provision for independent expenditures, the same model. And then we realized we got that wrong, because what if you have multiple independent expenditure committees, none of whom independently break the cap? You still have one candidate facing down 10 IEs, none of whom have broken the cap, but you're facing $1 million of negative ads, and you don't have the resources to counteract that. So we are trying to limit those imbalances, because I think that's important. The last thing I didn't mention, which really came to the fore in the last cycle, and I've got an expert to my left here, when we talked about the inside money versus the outside money, one thing we did not limit spending by legislative leaders, caucuses, or political parties in general elections, because the fact, I just could see no scenario where a legislative leader, for instance, backed a candidate of the other party against one of their own incumbents out of principle. It's not going to happen. We did limit some spending in primaries, but even that was a bit of a stretch, because until this last cycle, we really had not seen a scenario where leadership ran a candidate against one of their own members in a primary. You might not like some of the members in your caucus. You might have your frustrations with them, but you don't generally run opponents to take them out. And we had scenarios where we had rogue members of our caucus running candidates against other incumbents, and that's the worst, because you have to spend resources you'd like to save for the general election to help one of your incumbents who shouldn't have this primary to begin with. So that we did not anticipate, was this sudden interest in primary elections versus incumbent members of caucuses.
So reality is stranger than fiction, time and time again. Scott, you were tracking very closely a lot of the races where the contribution limits were lifted, and we all kind of were refreshing that page all the time, because that would show us that this was going to be a hot race, pretty much. So you found a couple things throughout where sometimes people were clearly confused on what those limits actually were. Sometimes the media would report caps lifted in a race because people had added all up the independent expenditures, but it wasn't quite right. Or you notice some things with party spending, where if a party does IEs in a race, the caps aren't lifted. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, sure. There are a number of, the law has a number of quirks. So, for example, if an independent expenditure committee spends more than $100,000 on a legislative race and on one candidate for or against, that cumulative total, then the caps are lifted. Well, we had an experience where the Illinois Republican Party was making independent expenditures on behalf of some legislative candidates, some Republican candidates in the House that they had supported, but because the caps were only lifted if an independent expenditure committee did that and not a party committee, the caps weren't lifted in that race, so they were able to raise money into the Illinois Republican Party. The Illinois Republican Party was able to spend unlimited amounts on behalf of these candidates independently, although the independence of that was somewhat in question. And those challengers to those incumbent Republicans they had to abide by the contribution limits, so they clearly seemed at a disadvantage. We also saw a couple instances where, in order to get around the contribution limits, a PAC was limited to $54,900, I believe. And so one particular organization wanted to get a bunch of money to one candidate they supported, so they made a max out donation. Then they created a new PAC their main PAC sent 54-9 to this new PAC, who then sent it to the candidate, and they did that like 3 or 4 times, and they were able to just get around the contribution limits, and no one seemed to care or complain about it. So it just seemed like, you could, if you were to present me any scenario, I could present you a legal way to get around the contribution limits. And this past primary, we have an example of just about every one of those ways. So we just found that, and again, I would attest that this is exclusively due to the change at the Supreme Court with Citizens United, and not necessarily a fault of the law. But if your goal was to limit the amount of money coming into the process, we've found that it just isn't really happening. The downside that we have is it's much harder to track this money, because now it's forced to come into the process through so many different avenues that it's very difficult to keep an eye on, and I'm somebody who has spent some time keeping an eye on it. But in the meantime, we have all of these new rules that have to be followed, and as Senator Harmon alluded to, it's still more difficult because you have to follow this new process to raise money. So we find that candidates are spending more time focused on fundraising and spending more time actually working on fundraising. So if our goal was to limit the corrosive influence of money in politics, we're finding that they're spending more of their attention and more of their time on fundraising, and the money's harder to track. So in that sense, it's almost been counterproductive.
I have a million questions, so I'm going to pick one. I know that enforcement can be an issue at every state level as well as the national level. I want to give Tom the chance to talk about our State Board of Elections. What is the role you see for the State Board of Elections in enforcing campaign finance laws, and explain that to us a little bit.
Well, the main role of the Campaign Disclosure Division has always been disclosure. So in other words, what we talked about, what Senator Harmon talked about earlier, in transparency. For the longest time in Illinois, there were no contribution limits. So our focus has always been, we want to be able to show everybody where the money's coming from. Well, where are you getting your contributions from? Where are you spending that? In implementing contribution limits, what we've seen is the usual problem when you have a new law. There's unintended consequences, and there's also, you'll have a portion of the committees out there doing their best to meet the new law, and there's always going to be some that are going to start thinking, okay, what can we do to get around it? And they're clever. There's always ways to get around these things. We're talking about the contribution limits. We've got a couple of ways that they get lifted, and what we found is it's really easy to lift those limits if you want to. Scott mentioned that we'd seen pretty much every way to do it. There's still one other way that we thought of a long time ago that nobody's done yet, and I'm not going to go into it, but it would be a real easy way to do it if you want to get rid of the limits. So it's the usual problem you have of action and reaction. We get a new law. It takes a while for people to understand it. Some people find ways around it. There's things you didn't think about that can happen, and so then we have to kind of fine-tune things and try to get back to it, send the pendulum swinging back the other way. So on a positive side for me, I like to think of it as job security, because there's always, things that we have to be trying to do to make sure the law gets implemented. Again, we're more of the disclosure side as opposed to going after committees, trying to fine them or trying to otherwise punish them for violations. So that's kind of where we're at.
So if it's not necessarily the role of the State Board of Elections to actively enforce, what do you think we can do to limit the loopholes that people find and people going around the law?
I think if I had the answer to that, we'd probably have some different laws. We just have to kind of keep trying to fine-tune things, and when we find, loopholes, to go ahead and get those closed. One thing that we've seen is, of course, the increase in what everybody calls dark money, the non-for-profits. There used to be a provision in the disclosure law that did require registration for nonprofits that were going to be active in political areas, making contributions, making expenditures. We don't have that anymore, so you do have a situation where you've got not-for-profit organizations that are essentially able to raise as much money as they want without reporting where that money's coming from. They can make contributions to the candidates or parties or the committees of their choice without coming under the requirement to form their own committee and file. So I think certainly finding a way to get not-for-profits back into the disclosure system would probably be a big step towards, at least shining some light on the dark money. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so I want to give sort of an example of what we're talking about because I think it can get sort of mixed up. Independent expenditure committees or super PACs are required to report all of their donors, but what can happen is a 501c4 or 6 organization, as they mentioned, can make a large donation to that super PAC. There's no contribution limits on super PACs. So, for example, not to use a partisan example, this happens on both sides, but Turnaround Illinois was given, I think, $2.9 million last year by Turnaround Illinois, Inc. Who are those people? Well, we can guess, but that kind of leaves it up to question. So this is to all the panelists, but are there any initiatives in the works or best practices you've seen as to correcting this problem? It's a stumper, yeah.
We knew that there would be ways to work around the limits. We knew that while we were drafting the bill. We tried to do it in a way that made it more difficult and that any effort to structure your operation in a way to get around it would be disclosed. We thought that even that degree of sunlight might discourage people from being too clever. But we knew from the get-go that there would be ways to structure your campaign financing to get around some of those limits. We hope that the disclosure, the transparency would be the real saving grace here. And other than the dark money, I don't think there are any things we would call loopholes in disclosure. You've got to disclose it if you put it in the bank. That's basically the rule. If you raise the money at some point or another, you have to disclose it. The dark money stuff is clearly something we're looking at, trying to figure out how do we regulate those not-for-profits that are the conduit to the independent expenditure committees. But we also recognized, again, from the beginning, the artificiality of the limits. There was a real push to adopt congressional-style limits, and we recognized that that would really put a strain on candidates, and we didn't like the way Washington politicians raised money. If you're in the House in a contested seat, you spend all your time, every day, all year, all 2 years, raising money. That's not a very good way to govern. So we also built into this, and we did think that the Supreme Court might at some point throw out the federal limits. And we built into the law a end of our limits if the U.S. Supreme Court ever threw out the congressional limits. So I think on those two tracks, the disclosure and the transparency is, in the end, much more important than the limits. And I think that's been borne out both in the success of the disclosure and the apparent failures of the limits.
Scott, did you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to say that when you have limits, the problem that you have is the cost of campaigns keep going up, and so there's the demand for money is great, and that's why we're seeing people go around the limits. And I thought that would dovetail into what Mr. McNary's been proposing, which is addressing the cost of campaigns.
Thank you. Well, let me just say that there's always been money in politics. Even before the Citizens United, there was money in politics. So I want to agree with Don, first of all, by saying that our system of government is a creature of an unjust finance system, not the cause of it. And as long as there are corporate forces that dominate our political system and then dominate the media, it's going to be harder and harder to get big money out of politics. So that was my initial thought about public financing and what it could do, but I've actually sort of abandoned that focus, and I just want to focus on rather than the 1P, process P, I want to focus on the 3 other Ps, which is increasing participation and increasing people in the process and increasing the power of those people in the process, and thus, rather than talk about how to do something that, because of the Supreme Court decision that says that money is speech, which is not true, because if money is speech, then those who have a lot of it can speak loud, and those who don't have it sit down and shut up. So that's not fair, and that's an unjust system, and we're going to eventually overturn that Citizens United. So that's a long-term reform. By the way, and forgive me, but not only on the back end did the Supreme Court make a decision that money is speech, on the front end, they ended up gutting the Voting Rights Act, which makes it and dilutes the power of people on the front end. So we have a Supreme Court that dilutes the power of the people on the front end as well as the back end. But the good news for those people who are in it for the long haul, that each one of those decisions and others are one Supreme Court justice away from being overturned. And so let us begin to make sure that this is not just a policy fight, this is also a political fight. So I want everybody that are not afraid to be engaged in the political process so that we can be closer to overturning those decisions. But going back to concentrating on the power and the process reform, contribution limits, they restrict and they don't empower. Transparency, that's important. Disclosure, yes. Accountability rules, yes. All these are important parts of a reform agenda. But until we address the root of the problem, that our elections are increasingly financed by wealthy and well-connected people, we won't have a democracy that works for all of us. We just can't focus on getting the money out. We have to focus on getting the people in. Just an example. The state of Illinois has billions of dollars in debt. Vendors and small businesses go unpaid. Needed services slash. Jobs cut. The governor puts a freeze on spending. Nothing we can do, he says. Then all of a sudden, eBay, Capital One, CDW Corporation, and Air Express, they get the freeze taken out. Those $100 million in corporate tax breaks, they go through. There is a perception. There is a perception that public special interests are purchasing public policy outcomes. And Justice Louis Brandeis said, either we may have a democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both. So I'll conclude by saying that how do we change the public perception that private interest money purchases public policy outcomes? How do we empower the everyday citizen, the waitress, the factory worker, the farmer, so they feel that their $5, that their $25, their $100 donation mean just as much as the private interest lobbyists and the corporate CEOs? How do we ensure that an elected official, a candidate for public office, instead of spending most of their time raising money, they can spend it raising issues and raising hopes? And one way to begin to raise hopes is to ensure pay-to-play scandals stop, is to adopt a clean elections voluntary option for public financing. The election process is the cornerstone of our democracy, and the chase for campaign funds should not undermine its integrity. In those states that do it, New York City, for example, there's greater diversity in participation. In Connecticut, it impacts the legislative impact of what they decide to talk about. In Arizona, it's changed the way business is done at the Capitol. In Maine, everyday people run and win, and the legislative process is strengthened. And so, again, I learned my values in three places. I learned it in my home, I learned it in my church, and I learned it in a public school system without even knowing it. Every day, they made me put my hand over my heart and say, one nation, under God, indivisible, not just for the privileged few, not just for the ones who lived on the right side of the track, not just for the ones who had the best lobbyists, but with liberty and justice for all. My brothers and sisters, let us continue to fight for a democracy where our leaders work for all of us and not just the rich or the powerful. We all do better. When we all do better, we need to replace corporate-funded elections with fair elections now.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I feel like I should clap. So you bring up a good point with public financing, and there's a couple different ways that could happen. You know, we've seen some people propose that elections be fully public financed, which would obviously be a huge financial investment. Then there are small donor matching systems, which our organization has been involved in promoting for quite some time, where small donations from, voters in the district would be matched by public funds. I'd like to get some opinions from panelists. Do you think either of those systems have a future here in Illinois, knowing the funding issues we have? Do you think that this is possible?
I'm an eternal optimist, but with the current state of our state budget, current woes, I think that to talk about a public financial system before we solve our current problems would just be a non-starter, and I think these two senators would agree. I do think that ultimately we would save more money with a fully funded public system, because the estimates, this is pre-Citizens United with $5 per household. It's probably a lot more than that now if you talk about the other monies in the system. But we're not talking about necessarily matching the money that the corporations and others do. It's just giving people who have a base of support an opportunity to collect the signatures and then and collect a certain amount of small contributions, the opportunity to be matched by a public fund, and just makes them viable. So we're not trying to get people to match what other people give. We're just trying to get everyday people who have a base, who can show they can get support, an opportunity to run and win. So I like a fully funded system, but again, I think even I am not pushing too hard for a public financing system until we get our current budgetary situation taken care of.
I have been a lead sponsor of public financing bills in the General Assembly over the last decade, and I am in favor of it as a concept. The two issues that really rise to the fore are the one you identified, given our financial straits especially, but just generally, people like the idea, but they don't want to pay for it. The second is just given the scale of wealth that is being poured into the political system, unless there's a change in the freedom to spend as much of your own money as you want to run for office, it's hard to match that with a public financing model. Just to give you some numbers, the gubernatorial election spending in 2010 all in was just over $50 million, which is obscene. In 2014, it was $102 million, and that was lopsided based on the inordinate money coming in. There's no way a public financing scheme could match that kind of volume. We focused recently on some judicial elections, public financing for circuit court or appellate court or Supreme Court, trying to figure out a way to prove that the model works. But even then, I think, especially given the confrontation today, the private money could drown out any sort of public financing.
Great. So one issue that I do want to get to is the idea of coordination between super PACs, independent expenditure committees, and candidate committees. You alluded to it, Dan, and Senator McCann, I know that you had some experience with this in your own campaign. Does anyone have a sense of what some common sense rules would be for coordination, or how we could address some of the issues that we saw in this recent primary?
First of all, let me address when Dan said there were some similarities or there was a mirroring with Representative Duncan and myself. The reason I was disagreeing is not because of Dan. I like Dan a lot. But, I think the difference is that I was voting with my constituency and not the other way. That might have something to do with the outcomes as well. That being said, I really don't know how you could ever really. I believe there's a lot of coordination going on. How much, I don't know. A lot is a very relative, subjective term. I know. How much, I don't know, and I don't know that you ever could know. I really truly believe that if your goal were to implement a plutocratic oligarchy as a form of government, the Citizens United ruling would be the gold standard by which you would model that system of government. So I really do believe that a wholesale overturning of Citizens United and getting away from the whole IE scenario is probably a better goal than monitoring coordination. But as I said at another symposium a few weeks ago, where Sarah was a part of, and Tom, again, I really think it comes down to the press, probably. I mean, I think, you've got a Watergate opportunity here for some hard-working press corps folks. I think there's a lot of coordination going on. I think a fair amount of it would be easily provable with some shoe leather and midnight oil. And so I think that's where the third rail comes in, would probably offer as much to that answer as anything.
Naive question. From me, member of the press. Yeah, I'm surprised. My assumption has been what do you need coordination for? It's out in the open. You just spent all that money. You just bought all those ads. What do you need to coordinate? So, it hasn't occurred to me to kind of go looking for coordination, because it seems like, well, there's, the actions speak for themselves, and it's unclear, and the lopsided spending seems like it's a big, it's enough.
And again, I don't want to interrupt Senator Harmon, but I think, on some of the issues, and I don't want to get into too many specifics here, but just sort of as an overview, there were some quote-unquote newspapers that were published and mailed to households around the state. And and I'm being facetious here. I'm going to be facetious so that we don't get into a realm that we don't want to get into today. But when the name of the third puppy that your dog had when you were in third grade, there probably was some coordination going on there. When photographs from 20 years ago pop up and get used in campaign literature, there was some coordination going on there. And if there's coordination going on at some of those levels, there's probably a lot more coordination going on at higher levels as well.
We talked to folks in D.C. about this when we were trying to write rules in Illinois on coordination, and I came away very discouraged because they said, it's so easy to get around that nonsense. You have a meeting before the IE is created, and you come up with a joint plan, and then you go your separate ways, and you don't talk until the election. And if you need to talk, you have a press conference, and you do this little public stand-up, and you do all this, and then everybody watches the press conference, and they know the change in strategy. And you bury on your website a whole lot of stock photos and videos, and then people who know what they're looking for can just go grab those and put them into the commercials if they didn't coordinate with you. It is very discouraging, the degree of pre-coordination that can eliminate the need for direct illegal coordination during the operation of the campaign.
Hence why I would say the direct overturning of the decision is the route that we should concentrate on.
So, in general, what I'm hearing is the idea that coordination can be prevented is inherently flawed, and there's not necessarily some small changes we could make to, make the situation better.
It's certainly open to suggestions, certainly looking for them, because it's an awful scenario. The barriers we have erected are easily surmounted, and that we need a better fence. We'll build a wall.
Dan, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I know that you were in the Duncan Stratton race. You were in the district a lot. When you were talking to voters, what was your sense as to how they were feeling by, a multi-million-dollar local race happening? Did it make them feel good, or?
You were so flattered, all this attention. To be clear, I spent some time. I wandered around. I followed the candidates. I canvassed a little bit in the district, just like I went to places. I was like, it was one of the interesting things about learning the geography of the district of like, where can I find people who will talk to me? Like, I went out to grocery stores, and the district was so narrow that like, I'd stand outside a grocery store and like, I would talk to 30 or 40 people over the course of an hour or two, and one or two of them would live in the district because the boundaries of the district were like a block or two on either side. So it was really, like the idea of like,
I think there are 8 zip codes in that district.
I don't know how many, but like, people didn't, I don't think people, I met a few people who were very politically engaged, and they were like, this is our district, I'm disappointed with this is how I feel. But people weren't always aware, right, of who their representatives are. I mean, that's a kind of something you see a lot. But yeah, people were certainly aware they were getting a lot of, people once the race really got underway were aware they were getting a lot of mail. But I didn't get a sense, I didn't have enough conversations to know like how people felt about like, to be able to make generalizations about how people felt like, geez, they're spending a lot of money over here, that's good or that's bad.
Well, I talked to some people who got 5 mailers a day in the weeks leading up to the election. And I know, Senator McCann, in your district, there was a lot of spending. Did you get a sense from people as to how that made them feel as far as the political process?
Yeah, it sickened most people who I spoke to from both sides of the aisle. We actually were the beneficiaries of quite a fair number of crossover votes, for the lack of a better term. And I think a lot of it had to do with it was offensive. And again, I'm sure that obviously negative campaigning works at a certain level, or else it wouldn't be done, I don't suppose. But I believe that it got to the point that it became totally obscene, and people were definitely repulsed and revolted by it. thank God.
Scott, I'd like to hear from you some of the trends in spending that you saw in this primary, and what are your thoughts going into November? Are we going to see the same thing, or are you going to see some new things crop up?
Well, I think in the primary, we saw a lot more spending through independent expenditure committees, specifically because they were intramural fights, and at certain times, people wanted to have more of an arm's length approach. In the general election, it's generally accepted that the Democrats are going to get together and fight the Republicans, who are going to get together, and they'll line up on they'll have traditional alliances. So I'm not expecting to see as much independent expenditure spending. It will be more traditionally through the state parties and the leadership committees of the four caucuses. And one additional advantage to that, in the general election, the law allows unlimited expenditures from candidate committees to party committees. So they were able, the House Democrats at the end of last December, they raised an insane amount of money into all of these targeted candidate committees, knowing that those races are going to be important in the fall, and that money will be there so they can spend it. But if one of those candidates doesn't have a competitive race, they can pull it back into the party committee and then spend it elsewhere. So you just don't see the same need for independent expenditure committees in the general as you would in the primary. Now, having said that, that was my expectation. And then just yesterday, Governor Rauner gave $2.5 million to an allied independent expenditure committee. I'm not really sure what they're going to use that for, but it leads me to believe there may be some independent expenditure spending, just not at the level that we saw in the primary.
So no more sneaky tricks, is that what you're saying?
Look, I mean, there's plenty of time for tricks, and there's plenty of smart people in the state to figure them out.
True. I would love to get some question cards, if possible. And then I have a question. We got a lot of reformers in this room and people focused on reform. What are your opinions as far as what we should be focusing on in the coming year? Anyone? Senator Harmon, maybe? Oh, no. Yeah, they will. Oh, I know. Senator Harmon, if you can answer my biggest question.
Yeah, I think that's in it. What about the unions?
Well, unions, we don't give out money.
Mhm.
Unions put people out there.
Mhm.
They do telephone. There are all sorts of things that don't show up.
Mhm.
If you have a union, but what about the council organization? Senator Harmon is the Democratic Union of Oak Park Council. What money does his council organization get? How do they use it? You're going to be using what's called automatic space. Who's there?
And I don't know too much about the politics. I'm just a folksy, whimsical downstater.
So maybe the question is.
So, but I on the union aspect of it, I find it interesting. I remember 2 years ago when the current governor was running, and he was, and I represent more public employees, more state employees than any other member of the General Assembly. Proudly so. I'm proud to represent those working people who make our cogs and our wheels turn in state government. I think it's interesting. I think it's somewhat hypocritical when you have someone saying that the unions are corrupt and the people who are in them are corrupt because those working people who are making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year are contributing $25 a month towards political, towards campaigns, to the political fund within the unions, and then you have a $20 million PAC put together by 3 individuals. I mean, it seems hypocritical to me. I mean, of course, collective bargaining is to me, it's capitalism at its finest. It's very much American, and those workers should be able to collectively pool a few dollars a month to support candidates of their choosing. And for 2 or 3 people to put in $20 million into one fund between them, and they're complaining about the people putting in $25 or $30 a month. Yes, ma'am, I agree with you.
All right, so I have a couple audience questions here. Please use your note cards. That's why we provided them. Thank you. So there's been a question for a long time. Do shorter elections equal less money in elections? Do you think that there's an opportunity for us to create a certain window for campaigning, or does that get into too many First Amendment issues?
My predecessor in office, Phil Rock, had always supported a primary in September. which I thought was an interesting idea. And I got no traction talking to my colleagues in Springfield about it. People have talked about having a June primary. I think that would be a horrible chill on legislative activity. If you think we're cowardly now, imagine if we had to finish up the session and run right home for a June 4th primary. I think that is not helpful. But I think the long season, one campaign ends and the next one begins. We are always in campaign season.
Yeah.
Want to speak? You asked when you were asking a question about would-be reformers in the audience. I thought you were talking about the audience. That's what Senator Harman and I thought you were referring to at first. I would like to say I would love to partner with Senator Harman and our colleagues in working on making the reform that they undertook a few years ago. Let's open it up, make it better now that we see, and there will be some things that we don't foresee this time also, and there will be some unintended consequences, but we have to do it. And I really believe the procurement side, again, I think we have it's a super duper large loophole that in these like say the gubernatorial committees and other committees that exist that allows that funneling right back in from people who are doing business or want to do business with the state. And then I also think there's probably, whether it was intentional or unintentional, I think there's probably a little too much power concentrated within the 4 legislative leaders.
And I want to answer that as well. I think that it's going to take a mix going forward of all of the current reforms if you open it up. But one of the things I like to see is if an option for public financing, and if not for political candidates itself, for judges. I mean, Supreme Court judges are supposed to be fair and impartial, and we should have an option for those judges who want to run clean, who want to run outside of the system, an option for public financing for judges. To come back to the union question, I will say that there should not be any unilateral disarmament. I mean, unions do give working people a voice in the political process, and that's particularly important in a political system right now where wealthy donors and corporate givers, generally outspend business and corporation. They spend labor 10 to 1. And matter of fact, Governor Rauner spent more of his own money in his one race for governor than all of the 4 labor unions spent on the last 4 governor races combined. And so we can talk about unions if you want to, but I do believe that unless we have a system where everybody is equal, we shouldn't unlevel the playing field by taking away unions' voice.
Real quick on the union issue, because it's important. 2 things. One, we live in a world where somehow all of the rules have been written with the notion that capital is somehow superior to labor. And I think that's a fundamental misstatement. I think, if anything, labor is superior to capital. Unions do organize and have a political action wing. The truth is, though, that if a union sends what we call a paid volunteer, an oxymoron, that needs to be reported. That needs to be disclosed. So, and I certainly have seen that. I've gotten those sorts of contributions, an in-kind contribution of paid staff time. So that is disclosed. If people volunteer, I hope we won't reach the point where we're prohibiting volunteerism. That would be, I think, completely upside down.
And I concur with Senator Harman. Labor is indeed superior to capital, and I believe our nation's first Republican president said so. So I agree wholeheartedly.
So I have a question here, basically asking, how is someone self-funding their campaign to the tune of millions of dollars, which we see, across the state in various elections? How is that different than a special interest giving a lot of money to campaigns, and why is that something that we accept? That's all I got. It's a bummer.
Unfortunately, that's the case. The Supreme Court said that they can, so they can. And then we have to, knowing that we don't have the power to change what the Supreme Court says is the law, at the Illinois General Assembly level, they're forced to accept those realities and deal with them the best that they can.
But on its face, the Supreme Court said it. But the Supreme Court once said that Plessy versus Ferguson, that people that look like me have no rights that people that look like you are bound to respect. That was a bad decision. That was a wrong decision. That was an unjust decision. And so we must, yes, it is today, but we must fight that decision. So long term, we will fight that decision. And as Senator McCann said, we must overturn that decision. And the good news is that Supreme Court decision is one Supreme Court justice away from being overturned, and the next president is going to appoint at least 3. But the second thing about that, though, is that when you talk about the options, one of the options that you have to consider, again, I'm giving up in trying to get all money out of politics. I've just decided that's not going to happen. If you squeeze the balloon one way, it's going to find a way to pop out in another. But at the very least we could do is to provide an option for people who do not have access to money, who may not need a lot of money to run, to be able to run on small contributions and their support and get a shot at being part of the system again. The way the system is now is that, well, unless we can't do anything about it, so, money is speech, so you don't count. But if you give somebody a window of hope, a possibility that they can run and win, I think people will take it. And it is very popular. I know Don just basically said that people don't want to pay for it. But in February of 2015, 79% of Chicago voters supported the advisory ballot question calling for a small donor match program for automatic candidates. In Seattle, recently, 65% recently voted to overturn their system for it. And so I think if you give people the option, let's try it. People might like it. And if they like it, they'll pay for it. And if they like it real good, they'll pay for it more and more and more, such as 80% of the representatives in the House and the Senate in Connecticut are now running clean. So I like to, just keep that as an option. And let's give people something to hope for, as opposed to something to restrict and something to say, well, this is a good reform. People want a big reform. That'll fix the problem.
So we talked about 501c4 and 501c6 organizations. There's a couple of questions here. So those organizations have to file an annual report with the IRS that shows, I think, top 3 donors or top 3 sources of income. Do you think that they should have to set up separate political funds and report all of those donors if they plan to be politically involved, such as some unions do, or do you think that there's another way to address that issue?
I'd be curious if the state board agrees with me. I think they're violating the law today in many cases. If they are established for no other purpose than to collect the money and funnel it to an IE, they're a political committee and they should be disclosing. But the way the setup is structured, they pretend that they're not. But if it's an existing not-for-profit with a existing 501c4 arm that does more than just raise money, that's different, but that's not what I think we're seeing. I think we're seeing these things established solely for the purpose of collecting money, and I think if they raise more than $3,000 for that purpose, they should be establishing themselves as a political committee and disclosing.
I would agree. I'm a big believer in if you're going to act like a political committee in terms of the way you're raising and spending money, then you should be filing and reporting like a political committee. We do have a situation where you've got some of these not-for-profits. They are allowed to, raise whatever money they want for their public policy purpose, or initiative. Unfortunately, what we're getting is that some of them, their actual initiative is really to support particular candidates. So you've got, if you want to use the old math thing, where if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So to me, if their way of getting their public policy, theme or whatever, I can't think of the word, but to do what they want to do is to support candidates, then they should be filing as committees. The trick, as usual, is trying to, prove that and trying to enforce it. And in some cases, you've got a situation where, for instance, an independent expenditure committee, the law says that they are created for the sole purpose of making independent expenditures. What the law doesn't say is, what if they do something other than that? As long as it's not, making an actual contribution directly to a candidate, if they do some expenditures that aren't independent expenditures, the law says they can't do that, but it also doesn't really say what happens if they do that. So, again, it's things evolving as we struggle with trying to find the proper way to enforce the law. I can think of one example where there was the an independent expenditure committee that made contributions back to their parent organization, if you will, so that the parent organization could then pay for advertising that would not meet the definition of an independent expenditure. It gets a little complicated to think about these things, but essentially it was doing something that, strictly speaking by the law, they're not really allowed to do, but we do run into situations like that where we can look at it and say, okay, yeah, they can't do that, but what can we do about that? We don't have great answers.
So the enforcement is a huge issue, and I think that that's something that we can all agree on, and is an issue at the federal level as well. So one more question. This kind of paints a bleak picture, and this often happens when we talk about campaign finance. So what do you think that we can do in this upcoming election? We know there's going to be a lot of spending. We know that there's going to be a lot of large contributions and large independent expenditures. How do you think that we can make sure that local voters still feel involved in their local elections and don't feel that their voices are drowned out by this?
Vote. Get 5 people who don't normally vote to vote. Ask them to get 5 people who don't normally vote to vote. That's the secret. It sounds simple and naive at the same time, but we have a dismal percentage of people participating in elections. We've done a great job in Springfield in expanding access to the franchise through online voter registration, same-day voter registration. We're on the governor's desk is automatic voter registration, so that everybody who interacts with the Secretary of State's office to get a driver's license or a state ID should be eligible and registered to vote. But people still have to get up and vote. We've made it easy. You can get a mail ballot. You don't have to vote absentee. You can vote early. It's a month-long election day, basically. But people still have to vote. And that's on all of us. I mean, we try to turn people out, but everybody needs to be engaged. Everyone needs to take responsibility for themselves, and then some additional responsibility for their families, their friends, their neighbors. Go out and vote.
I agree. I mean, as more and more states try to restrict and suppress the vote, Illinois has done a great job of expanding access to the vote and make it easier for people to vote. And that's one of the keys, is to make sure that that we expand our democracy and the right to participate in the political process so broad that more and more people can access the vote. But the bottom line is that most people won't vote unless we ask them to vote or unless we encourage them to vote. I still believe that organized people can still beat organized money if we're organized enough, and if we are united, if our message is clear, and we give people a reason to come out, and we mobilize people to come out, then they will vote. In those places where they are restricting the right to vote, someone says, "What should you do?" I said, "Well, vote anyhow." And they said, "Well, in those places where there are unreasonable barriers and we have to do this to get the IDs, what do you do?" I said, "Well, figure out what those barriers are and vote anyhow." At one time, people who looked like me couldn't vote, period. And we had to ask questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? And how many jelly beans in a jar. There's a real true story about a man who went to the polls, and the question he was asked to exercise his franchise was, what does anti-disestablishmentarianism mean? And he looked at the clerk and said, "I guess that means I won't be voting today." He couldn't vote. We can vote, and we have to encourage everybody to take advantage of it. If we do that, let's not be cynical. A little cynicism is healthy. Too much kills the spirit. So let's encourage people to get out and vote anyhow.
Anyone want to follow that? All right, well, on that note, thank you so much for coming out today. Thanks you to our panelists. We really appreciate you taking the time. And I hope to see you at our next event. Thanks.